Now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is facing criticism from the opposition for failing to warn Australians about the risk of conflict in the Middle East in the week leading up to the strikes.
In the week leading up to the strikes in Iran, when we had faltering peace talks between the administration and Iran, when we had two US carrier strike groups moving into the region, the Foreign Minister of Australia did not make a single public statement personally about Iran. The Prime Minister answered one question about it in a radio interview because he was asked, but spent more time talking about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor.
Joining me now is former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. Alexander Downer, thank you for your time this evening. Do you think this criticism is fair? Should the Prime Minister have put the Australian public on notice about the very real potential for conflict?
Well, I think the Foreign Minister and DFAT should have reflected the building of war in the DFAT travel advisory, and the Foreign Minister should have made a series of public statements. I mean, perhaps the Prime Minister could have backed them up, but it would have helped because it would have ensured that many of those Australians who have been trapped in the Middle East would have had the opportunity to leave. And after all, the government would have had a huge amount of information flowing to it from the Americans on the Americans' preparations. So, there's no excuse here. They were just a little slow in getting the message out to Australians.
Well, since we learned about the strikes, Albanese has made statements in support of the US and Israeli action against Iran, and I suppose that's welcome, especially when you consider the increasing hostility the government has showed towards Israel in particular, before the Bondi massacre, that is. What do you make of the Albanese government's response since the strikes were launched?
Well, actually, I think their response has been pretty good. Their response has been a great deal better than the response of the British and the Spanish governments. I mean, the Spanish Prime Minister has gone out and condemned what the Americans have done, as though we'd be better off with the Ayatollahs and mullahs running their nation of terror and oppression. One day this Iranian activity had to be brought to an end. So Albanese has been pretty good on that. Keir Starmer, on the other hand, for a while denied the Americans' use of British bases, in particular Akrotiri in Cyprus and Diego Garcia in the Chagos Islands, which is in the Indian Ocean. And I think the British Prime Minister and the British government has shown itself to be not just weak, but very untraditional. The great leaders of Britain, the Thatchers, the Blairs, you can go all the way back, as people often do, to Winston Churchill. These people have been great and dynamic leaders who stood up for freedom, and Keir Starmer could never be accused of that.
Well, as Donald Trump said, he's certainly no Winston Churchill. I'll talk about that a little bit later with in more detail with Colonel Richard Kemp. But as Chris Kenny showed on his program earlier this week, former Prime Minister, a Liberal Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, well, he's called this an illegal war. He's taken a similar position, it would seem, to the Greens. What do you make of Mr. Turnbull's intervention in this?
Well, I think former Liberal leaders, and I'm one of them, should stick with the philosophy of the Liberal Party. I mean, the Liberal Party is never going to be a political party on the side of a terrorist and oppressive, freedom-destroying regime like the Iranian regime. And as for the legality, I'm not sure where he gets that line from, but I would have thought this was perfectly legal. The United States was threatened with attacks on its bases in the Middle East, and indeed those bases have been attacked. The United States has every right to defend its bases and its interests and to help defend its allies in the Middle East. And its allies, by the way, are not just Israel, but importantly include Israel, but countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, these countries, Oman and so on, these countries have been ruthlessly attacked by the Iranians. Thank God the Americans have been dealing with those attacks and with those threats. I mean, people who run around with slogans like illegal, or what is legal about what the Iranians have been doing since 1979 in the Middle East. They have acted constantly beyond the bounds of international law, and up until now, no one's done much about it.
No, it's so true. It was quite an extraordinary statement, I thought, from him. And I just don't know what side he's even on anymore. Look, this conflict has drawn attention to our own defence capabilities. What action would you like to see from the government to shore up our defences?
Well, I think this should remind us that we have to make a solid contribution to the building of our defences. So, for example, missile defence is an absolutely fundamental part of what the Israelis and the Americans and their allies in the Middle East are depending on at the moment. We have almost no missile defence systems here in Australia at all. We don't have minesweepers, for example. If someone decided to mine our strategic ports, we don't have any way of clearing those mines. So we have underinvested for quite some years now in our defence capability, and we need to think more seriously about it and not take our security for granted, which is something we have done for pretty much the last 20 years.
Yep, and it's increasingly becoming a concern. Alexander Downer, thank you so much for your time tonight.